Welcome those of you who are joining us online. It's been good here so far. If you can't, come join us sometime in person if you haven't yet. It's a whole different experience, but grateful to be with you online whenever it is that you engage with this message. Grateful for the opportunity to be together, even with this technology. And this morning's message is the second of 6 in a series that is called Guidance from the Book of Daniel, actually focusing, of course, on his life. The life he lived, and the title of the message is Living a Life of Distinction. That would describe Daniel and his 3 friends, for sure. And it's about looking at his life and seeing how he lived in that day and age. It was 600 years before Christ touched down on this planet. But Daniel's relationship with God was so real and so deep and so intense that his life made a difference, for sure. And that's what we'll be talking about. The specific difference is connected to the life of distinction that he lived. So that's the title of the message. And I wanted to ask this question. And you should be able to answer it really quickly, one way or the other. Have you ever met someone who was world-renowned because of who they were or what they did? And I'm betting that if I was a betting man, I'm betting that if you have met someone who was world-renowned, that something tells me you didn't have to think very long about it. If you've met someone who doesn't just have a national but international platform based on perhaps the family they were born into, hopefully more than that, just the difference they've made, or somebody who's an elite world-class athlete or business guy or musician or whatever, somebody who's at the top of their game, and the top of their game is way above the top of most everybody else's game. To meet that person that's just inspiring in and of itself. They've made a bunch of choices that put them in that place. That is part of what this is all about too, that our life is composed of the choices we make. There's no denying that. It's pretty exciting and can even be overwhelming to meet someone like that. And why is that? It's because theirs is a life of great distinction. Theirs is a life of great distinction. Something about them sets them apart from everybody else. And so it's captivating to meet somebody like that. Bonus points if you're influenced in a positive way by their life, even just from afar, let alone an actual relationship. A life of distinction impacts the life around that life of the people who know their life is distinct. If you were here last week, you may remember that I ended the introduction to the message with these words. This should sound familiar if you were here last week or heard the message. This series is based on the influence of one life highlighted in an Old Testament book bearing his name. About 600 years before the birth of Christ, the prophet Daniel arrived on earth. Though the Babylonian culture in which he found himself renamed him Belshazzar, he kept his God-given identity and maintained his God-blessed commitment to the God he served through it all. And I ended it by saying today's message will establish the basis for the upcoming messages. This is the first of the upcoming messages, calling us to be different so we can make a difference for good forever. In order to make a difference, we need to be different, and in order to make that difference the way it should be, God will have his way, so it's a difference for good and it's forever. And one of the expressions of a different kind of life is a life that is very distinctive in its especially in its expression, not just its existence. Indeed, this and every upcoming message in this series will be about being different so that we can make a difference for good forever. Here's the theme, the sermon in a sentence or two. Be sure to stay set apart by and for God and keep standing firm in obedience to him. I guess you can't be sure to stay set apart by and for God if you haven't yet experienced that. That is a whole nother message in a very real way. If you can't say for sure that you've encountered God and you have a relationship with him now that does set you apart, he's the one who set you apart, and you're set apart for him, for his glory, for him to have his way on the earth through your life. If that hasn't happened yet, hit me up and we'll do coffee or talk or something. But once that happens, and I don't mean to say what I just said so lightly, but once someone truly encounters God and has a present tense relationship with God, the true and living God, then if that's happened, God himself has set them apart for himself to make a difference in the lives of everyone that person, you, me, whoever it might be, would encounter. And we need to keep standing firm in obedience to him. Because it wasn't all that long ago we talked about how anybody can start a race, but not everybody finishes a race. There's way more people often at the starting line than the finish line, depending on what the race is. And the application this morning, what to do with what you hear, is to be sure. Oh, I read the application, not the theme yet. Excuse me. Well, that was we won't have to spend much time there when we get to it right now. So back to the theme. Someone who serves God gets noticed because there is a life of distinction. That's the theme. And I just spent a bunch of moments there acknowledging the application concerning being and staying set apart by and for God. But again, the theme is someone who serves God, anyone who serves God, wholeheartedly, at least eventually, gets noticed because theirs is a life of distinction. Somebody who's living for God, their whole life is different than somebody who's not living for God. Because if they're not living for God, they're not truly living with God. And so their life is, that person's life gets noticed because their life is a life of distinction. Here's the focus. Just a little setting up of this particular message. Daniel chapter 1 begins with Daniel writing as a witness to the Babylonian invasion of Judah. Jeremiah had pleaded previously for more than 20 years for the citizens of Judah to return to their God. They had wandered far, and they had stayed far away for a long time. He warned them that if they refused, they would be captured by the Babylonians. And you can read that warning in that prophecy in Jeremiah 25, verses 1 through 11. It's not as though they didn't hear from God through this prophet. It's just that they didn't listen to God. And that happens all the time, sadly, and sometimes in my life and yours. Just as Jeremiah said would happen, God's people were indeed taken captive because they refused to return to him. The Babylonian king who led this conquest was Nebuchadnezzar. He was known to be a cruel and ruthless ruler. Before his encounter with Daniel, Hannah, Mishael, and Azariah, those were the names they were given before the Babylonians gave them the different names. Nebuchadnezzar had already killed the sons of one of Judah's kings before their father's eyes. That's as cruel can be. He had another man roasted slowly to death over a fire. He ruled, Nebuchadnezzar did, by fear and intimidation. His word was absolute law, which is very connected to what comes up when Daniel's friends wind up in the fire. His word was absolute law. And when Daniel is thrown into the lion's den because he had signed that foolish decree, or that was Darius who had done that. But Nebuchadnezzar, he was a bad, bad guy. This is who, Nebuchadnezzar's, who these teenagers, and they were teenagers when they were brought by the Babylonians, who these teenagers faced after he told his servant Ashkenazi to find an elite group of young men, that was the charge he was given, from Israel to be groomed by the Chaldeans to serve as wise men in Nebuchadnezzar's court. Today we will see how God enabled them, Daniel and Hannah and Mishael and Azariah, how God enabled them, strengthened them to stay unstained from the context they were in by staying true to him. And that's the big takeaway today. That they remained unstained from the context they were in by staying true to God. They didn't cower or capitulate in any way. Oh, may that be said of us in the world in which we live, which is in such opposition to God in so many ways. That we would remain unstained and stay committed to him. That's the example that Daniel and his three friends give us here at the beginning. But for this morning, to really, and I don't think I'll say much about this further on, but the Chaldeans were, what Nebuchadnezzar was trying to do was disciple, is a word we would use today, these 4 guys into that culture. 3 years they would spend on turning them from who they were to who they wanted them to be. Perhaps not unlike when a civilian goes into basic combat training and comes out a soldier. The same person who got off the bus at basic training is not the same person who walks at the end of that and they are, they're a soldier now. Nebuchadnezzar was attempting to reformat, as it were, their minds and their hearts to the ways of the Chaldeans, to the wise men that Nebuchadnezzar often consulted. So, the first point this morning is this, concerning living a life of distinction. A life of distinction is the result of strong convictions and consistent discipline, both of which are key ingredients to, that life of distinction. Doesn't just happen, doesn't just happen because it happens. A life of distinction is the result of choices that somebody makes, very much connected to strong convictions, hopefully convictions connected to the truth and what is right, and consistent discipline. You don't get to the top and stay at the top without the discipline that brings you there and the discipline that keeps you there. And underneath that first point, it says, living in love for and obedience to God is life's ultimate liberation. Some people would think, obedience to God must be a prison. Quite the opposite. Obedience to God sets you free from the prison of disobedience to God. You're free. I think of even, what will be celebrated tomorrow on Martin Luther King Day, the national holiday. I'm free, thank God. At last I'm free. And that happens when we truly do love God, and then the evidence of that love for God is what? If you love me, you'll obey me, is what he said. And so turn there to Daniel chapter 1, and verses, what did I list there? We're going to look at verse 8, and then 11 through 13. Let me make sure. I don't have it memorized like I do the New Testament, the order of the books. Malachi, Zechariah, Haggai. Daniel's back before that. After Ezekiel? Yeah, thank you. I should definitely know that. I see Daniel at the top here. Every now and then, it couldn't have anything to do with my age. Every now and then the circuits don't seem to connect. Yes, Daniel chapter 1, which is the chapter we're going to be in. And let me read from 1 through 13, and then we'll just highlight those verses to get the context for the second point. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. That's a loaded statement. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. These he carried off to the temple of his god, lower G, in Babylonia, and put it in the treasure house of his god. So just those 2 verses set the stage for trouble, 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 trouble. Then the king ordered Ashkenaz, chief of his court officials, to bring in some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility. So this is, again, there's prestige in this family lineage. Young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. Again, because he's going to flip all those attributes that they have on their head for his benefit. At least he's going to try. The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years, and after that they were to enter the king's service. Among these were some from Judah: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The chief official gave them new names. To Daniel, the name Belshazzar; to Hananiah, Shadrach; to Mishael, Meshach; and to Azariah, Abednego. And most of us know them by their Babylonian names, right? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego is who we call them. That's not who God called them. That's who the Babylonians called them. That's who they were known for. That's what they were called when they were thrown into the fire. But it's interesting to note that those are the names we remember them by. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are who we say were thrown into the fire. Not Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So, for whatever that's worth. Here we go, and this is the verse we're going to be looking at. But Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, and asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself this way. Key verse. Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine. And he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself this way. Not that there was anything wrong with the food and the wine in and of itself, but that it was offered to idols, and that he would not have anything to do with that. Now God had caused the official to show favor and sympathy to Daniel, but the official told Daniel, I'm afraid of my lord the king, who has assigned your food and drink. Why should he see you looking worse than the other young men your age? And here's, you remember I said earlier, Nebuchadnezzar is a bad dude? Listen to what this guy says. The king would then have my head because of you. He was afraid to withhold the food from Daniel at Daniel's request, because he figured they'd be, just skinnier and not as strong as the other guys who had the king's food and the wine, that they would look sickly. And if that was the case, then Nebuchadnezzar would cut this guy's head off. He was scared of him. That's how terrible Nebuchadnezzar was. Daniel then said to the guard whom the chief official had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, please test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat the royal food, and treat your servants in accordance with what you see. So he agreed to this and tested them for 10 days. That's pretty wise on Daniel's part, because he just knew, I cannot eat this food because it's offered to idols. So with wisdom that God gave him, he approaches the right guy and asks the right thing, and the right guy all but says, no way, buddy, because the king will have my head if you aren't as healthy as these other guys, and that's not going to happen if you don't eat the food he gives you. And then Daniel, obviously with respect, he uses the word please. Remember your pleases and thank yous. He says, please test your servants for 10 days. Okay, I'm not asking for the whole 3 years. I'm asking for 10 days. Let us eat just these vegetables and drink just water, no wine. Not that there's anything wrong with the other food or the wine in and of itself. Let us do that. They remain ceremonial, rightly related to God with the food they eat, not sacrificed. And then come check us out in 10 days. We'll see in a moment how that turned out. The result of strong convictions and consistent discipline. Daniel and his 3 friends found themselves in a place not of their choosing. Have you ever found yourself in a place like that? Or a situation like that? Of course you have. Not of their choosing. Led by a king whose heart was selfish and wicked. Have there ever been people over you with influence and power who didn't love God? Who had some say-so in your life? I would imagine all of us could nod our head to that. So this isn't something that we can't relate to, but this is where Daniel and his friends found themselves. And in a very rare way, they were conscripted. They were pulled into this situation under duress. They did not want to be there, but this is where they found themselves. As we ponder just how hard it must have been for them, because they were likely just teenagers when they were brought to Nebuchadnezzar, so it's all the more impressive that they were such young men of character. They were the elite of their culture. That's who Nebuchadnezzar went fishing for. That's who he told him to look for. Men of prestige, young men of prestige, handsome, and what was one of the other things that he acknowledges that they were looking for? Showing aptitude for every kind of learning. Why? Because he intended to change what their brains were being filled with. And well-informed, quick to understand. That's who these young guys were. And again, that makes it all the more impressive. What families they must have come from to be at that age so mature in their convictions and their commitments and their disciplines. And again, to have the boldness, even as men that young, to seek to have a conversation with a guy who could lose his life if it didn't go well for these guys that he was given charge of, to ask him, can we please not eat this food? He never specifically said why, did he? But we know that's why, because it was offered to idols. Nebuchadnezzar, we heard at the beginning, brought these, the booty from the war back and put it in his place for his gods, which aren't the God. So it's just a mess of a situation that they're in, which makes, again, super impressive that they would maintain what they did. So again, verse 8, but Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine. Not going to happen. If he can have his way in any way, he's not going to eat that food, and neither are they. Because as obedient Jewish believers, they would adhere to the moral, civil, and ceremonial laws. And one of those laws was not to eat food offered to idols. It became a real sticking point at the very beginning. And this little battle they won right away, because Daniel was able to convince this guy, just give us 10 days. 10 days, that's all. And then verses 11 through 13 again. Daniel then said to the guard, whom the chief official had appointed over him and his 3 friends, test your servants for 10 days, give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink, and then compare our appearance with that of the other young men who eat the royal food. And then, in so many words, do what you will after you see us after that. That's basically what he says. And then, wonder of wonders, the guy said, okay. Can you imagine how sweet that sounded to Daniel and his friends? This really worked. We're not going to have to eat that food. Well, how joyful their hearts must have been. But still, in the context of an oppressive, dark, ungodly environment into which they were forced. In a very real way, they were forced labor. And that, again, I know that seems like an appropriate way to say it, because he and those 3 guys were brought not because they wanted to come, and they then were, again, thinking of a military, it's as though they had their head shaved and issued, army issue, whatever, that they were then called to get in step with this culture and do it our way, or you're in trouble. And so it was forced labor. They were enslaved with the desire to be broken and remade. And that's what the world will try to do to us. Break us and remake us, far removed from God's will for us. What we do is submit to God, and He changes our lives. But the world will attempt to keep us where we shouldn't be, believing things that aren't true and doing things we shouldn't be doing. And so it is a very, very, very real battle. But they remained unbroken, and they remained free on the inside because of their convictions and discipline. And I think of the fact that, using the word that certainly Nebuchadnezzar was trying to break them. And they were just 4 of many other young men that were brought from I think it was Judah. And so, they had a plan for their lives. And this movie comes to mind, and the title of it is Unbroken. How many of you have seen the movie Unbroken? Just a few of us. If you've never seen, so for those of you who haven't seen it, of course, I don't know who has or hasn't as you're watching, but if you haven't seen the movie Unbroken yet, see it. It's the true story of Louis Zamperini, and he was captured by the Japanese, and it was horrible. It was hellish. It was oppressive and just terrible. But what this guy would not do is allow them to break him. And there's a couple scenes where this bad guy is trying to end his life because at that point he was probably weighed less than 100 pounds. He had plane had crashed. They'd survived at sea for a long time. One of the guys died. By the time they were not rescued, but by the time the Japanese found them and took them and imprisoned them, they were already very weak and very sick. But he would not be broken. And that's the point. In his heart, in his mind, in his soul, he knew who he was and where he came from. And he was not going to let these torturers and tormentors have their way on the inside. It's a powerful story. And he lives to tell the story. It's first came out as a book and a movie a few years ago, Unbroken. And in that story, he refused, again, to let who he was be stolen by where he was. Let me say that again. He refused to let who he was be stolen because of where he was. Sometimes we can't do anything about where we're at, not just geographically, but relationally and you know, in employment and stuff. Sometimes we're in hostile situations. And while we can't necessarily immediately do anything about our surroundings, we have to do everything we can to guard the inside of us, especially as it pertains to our convictions and the discipline that is required to maintain those convictions and commitments. What's powerful about this story is that grace prevailed in Louis Zamperini's life even before he knew God. Daniel and his friends, and you and I, especially as Christ followers, Daniel and his friends had the advantage of God's blessings on their upbringing. They were privileged that way. They were very blessed. And it was evident because when they arrived there, they maintained their identity, and because of that, they maintained their integrity. They chose to do that. And here's one more interesting factoid. Daniel was a little boy during the reign of Josiah. Yes, it was during the reign of Josiah. And if you know the story of Josiah, Josiah came along as also a very young king and basically flipped everything around and reestablished things that had been so out of place for such a long time. So Daniel was the beneficiary of Josiah's passion to be right with God through and through. So when Daniel was a little boy, the context of his childhood was the king at that time of Judah was because not all the kings had their hearts after God. Josiah did, and Daniel saw it, and he saw how it's supposed to look. A life of distinction, a life of commitment to God. King Josiah was the example. And Daniel just somehow picked that up and ran with it. And his family of origin obviously had a big part to play in that. So a life of distinction is the result of strong convictions and consistent discipline. And the second point is this. A life of distinction is most clearly seen by our not of this world attitude and actions. A mindset and heart song, we'll say when we ask the questions at the end here. Not of this world. I don't know who it is, but there's some company that's published this logo of like a big N and an O-T that forms the cross, the shape of a cross, and then a big W. So it doesn't necessarily look like not N, small O, small T, a big N, capital N, and capital W, but the whole focus of it is not of this world. And Daniel and his friends knew they were not of this nation. They were not of this culture. They knew that. And certainly for us as Christians, we need to understand we are not of this world. Earlier here at Cornerstone, we read this at the beginning of the service. We'll cycle back to it when we close this message. Jesus in John 17 says, they are not of the world any more than I'm of the world, his disciples. We as Christians are not of this world. We are in this world. But we are not of this world. Let's look at Daniel chapter 1, verses 15 through 20. At the end of the 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. Who did that? God. Vegetables and water? So the guard took away their choice food and the wine they were to drink and gave them vegetables instead. Because now he knew he's not going to get his head cut off. Think about that. Was God with them? Yes. Was it really obvious here? Yes. It's not always obvious, but God's always with us. Healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. To these 4 young men, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning. Maybe in today's world we'd say they were little brainiacs. Because just the ability to amass the knowledge, and not just the knowledge, but the understanding of that. Of all kinds of literature and learning. Daniel, this is what set him apart after more than the other 3 guys being set apart. Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. Sometimes that got him in trouble big time, but it always was beneficial for the people who would respond to the visions he had and the dreams that he could interpret. At the end of the time set by the king to bring them in, the chief official presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. Again, can you imagine them standing before him? That'd be pretty overwhelming. They know this guy's a bad dude, and he's got all the power. And now they're brought before him. The king talked with them, and he found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Again, listen to what that sentence says. The king talked to them, and he found none equal, not one equal to any of these 4. And there were lots of others that were a part of this story. So they entered the king's service. In every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, check this out. In every manner of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the musicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom. There's some new kids on the block, right? These guys are guys. These guys are something else. And for Nebuchadnezzar himself to say 10 times better. And obviously he had already tried to amass the best of the best. And so whatever Nebuchadnezzar's best effort at the best of the best resulted in, these 4 guys who were blessed by God were 10, in his own acknowledgement, his own admission, these guys are 10 times better. These 4 guys are 10 times better than all of my best. And this is just chapter 1. Think about the implications of this and what is actually going on. And it was because, I didn't say what's under the second point. This is an important truth. When we live, I couldn't fit the word according in there to make it fit, but I will just insert it now. When we live according to our identity and purpose, who God says we are and why God says we are, when we live according to our identity and purpose, and I just love this as a word picture, we shine like Rudolph's nose. All right. I'll put some mud on that thing. And what wound up happening? That nose got them through the storm. But that point, and that's such a great, that's not really a cartoon, is it? It's whatever that animation is. But he comes in, and everyone's like, oh, and even the Santa, when he was super skinny, like, oh, get him out of here. But then the storm hits. Now he's the hero. Take the mud off. He's going to lead us. And in a very similar way, when meeting I'm at every Friday is you got to do a checkup for the neck up to take care of any stinking thinking. Because what happens is if you have stinking thinking, then that's going to fuel a stinky attitude, and that's going to lead to some really stinky choices. Acknowledging that when we have I'm in this world, but it's all going to be burned up one day. So I'm in this temporary world, living a temporary life. So I'm in this world, but I am not of this world, because the world I'm truly in, the kingdom I'm eternally a part of, is this kingdom of God. And Jesus, in Matthew 5, I think it's 5 or 6 for sure, pray this way: your kingdom come, your will be done. Where? Here on earth. How? As it is in heaven. So that's the world we're of, the world in the realm of heaven, the spiritual realm. But we're currently in this place, not unlike Daniel and his friends in Babylonia, with the Chaldeans attempting to disciple them. The world has its agenda, and God has his plans. And we need to be sure that we line up with God's plans, that we understand our identity and purpose. And again, it's just so beautiful to read these last verses. So they get the green light to not eat the food that was offered to idols. And then, verse 17 again, to these four young men, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning, and Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. A unique group of kids. Shaped by God having his way in their early years. Again, certainly to be raised during the time of King Josiah, who was a king after God's heart, who was attempting to reform and restore what had been destroyed and forsaken by a king whose heart wasn't where it needed to be, or should have been. And again, verse 20. In every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom. You can only imagine the jealousy that elicited from them. And that was part of what would show up to bring some tension in their lives. And how can that be? It can be because of God. It's God's favor. When God causes others to see his work in and through you, it's God's favor on somebody's life. Even people who don't know him, even people who are worshiping false gods, acknowledge it. They don't say that's something God has done, but they say that's something that's been done. There's no denying it. You can't miss it. These four lives are lives of distinction. And this one especially, this Daniel guy, his life is over the top distinct. It's so obvious, as it should be of us. Not everybody's going to like it. In this verse we're going to look at in just a moment, we'll acknowledge that the world will hate us just like it hated Jesus. And the world was not always thrilled with what God was doing through his people through all of the centuries. So again, how do we cultivate this not of this world mindset? Because it's one thing to acknowledge it's a reality, but it's a whole other thing to actually experience it. And back to John 17. This will be the third week in a row we reference a portion of this prayer in John 17. I want to highlight verses 15 through 19. John 17, verses 15 through 19. This is Jesus praying for his disciples in their presence. So they're hearing him say these words as he's praying to his Father. Can you imagine what an overwhelming experience that must have been? To hear the Son of God praying to his Father, and they hear it with their own ears in real time. And who's he praying for? Them. My prayer is not that you take them out of the world, but that you protect them from the evil one. Certainly we can deduce from that this is a battle. And here's the key. They are not of this world, even as I am not of this world. Not anymore. They used to be, but not anymore, and never again, till they take their last breath. Not of this world, even as I am not of it. And then he prays that they will be set apart by the truth. And then he acknowledges the source of the truth is his word, which is true. As you sent me into the world, I have sent them into the world. For them I sanctify myself, that they too may be sanctified by me. And it was... I said it earlier, but didn't reference it here in my notes. I do want to highlight verse 14. I have given them your word. So back to verse 14 in John 17. We're coming in for a landing here. Just one other reference in Colossians. John 17:14. I have given them your word, and the world has hated them. For they are not of this world any more than I am of the world. And you and I, as followers of Christ, can be sure we're going to suffer some. Because if they hated him, they're going to hate us. So we're sure to suffer some. And in light of that, again, not to let that wear us down or cause us to capitulate and say, oh, I guess I'll just go the way of the Chaldeans and the Babylonians and, back in the Old Testament, I'll just go the way of the world. And no, the way of the world is going to take you to a place that you don't want to be. For sure, for sure, for sure. So to maintain that, last week I talked about the thermostat or the thermometer. Understanding the difference between them and the significance of asking God to make us thermostats in a world where the temperature is set not on heaven but the world itself. And to be able to embrace that. And then the Colossians chapter 3. Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians. Colossians chapter 3. And verses 1 through 4. Since then you have been raised with Christ. Set your hearts on things of the world. That is not what it says. It says set your hearts on things above. Because what are we? We are not of this world. And you and I need to keep telling ourselves, I am not of this world. I am not of this world. I am in this world. It's temporary and my life is fleeting. I am not of this world. I am in this world. Since then, you have been raised with Christ. Past tense occurrence, present tense reality. Set your hearts on things above, where Christ is seated at the right hand of God. Set your minds on things above. It doesn't get any more clear than that. Set your minds on things above, because your mind tunes your heart. Set your minds on things above, not on earthly things. For you died, and your life is now hidden with Christ in God. When Christ, who is your life, appears, then you will also appear with him in glory. It's as if to say God has tucked us inside of himself. Though we're on full display, the reality of who we are, the totality of our eternal identity is in Christ now, because he's made us his. When he says, set your minds on set your minds on things above, not on earthly things, he means it. Because if we don't set our minds on where they need to be, then the earthly things at best will distract us, at worst will destroy us. They will. They're earthly things, they're temporary things. You do need a car and you do need a place to live, but the make and model of your car and the size of where you live is very irrelevant. If you have a roof over your head and clothes to wear and food to eat, you're good to go. Does your car have 4 wheels? Does it go from point A to B and back to point A? You're good to go. That whole thing, there's a song I mentioned many months ago called A New Point of View. I highly recommend that. A New Point of View, the Gaylor Vocal Band. It talks about a guy who goes on a hot air balloon, and he's looking out over the hot air balloon. He sees these tiny little cars on tiny little streets with tiny little houses and tiny little yards and tiny little pools. From the vantage point of the hot air balloon, all you see is a bunch of tiny little cars and tiny little streets, tiny little houses, tiny little yards, tiny little pools. Seemed like a waste to spend your time and money on. I mean, in the sense of letting it consume you. Nothing wrong with any of those things at all. And from the ground point of view, they're not tiny, are they? And perhaps that's the problem. But set your mind on things above, not on earthly things. That is how, when we hear Jesus himself praying and saying that we are not of the world any more than he is of the world, and when we hear Paul admonishing the Colossians to do this, because you've been raised with Christ, set your hearts on things above where Christ is seated. Set your minds on things above, not on earthly things. That's how we cultivate this not of the world mindset, which results in the proper or the better attitudes and actions. I'll end with watching last night. I saw part of the Chargers game and the Jaguars. If you saw it to the end, the Jaguars amazingly came back in the second half. It was just one of those incredible football games. When they went into the locker room, somebody must have said something, because the Jaguars that came out for the second half aren't the Jaguars that came out for the first half. And they won by 1 point. That's a cool game. And I remember as I was watching it that I was reminded about the phrase, get your head in the game. I'll bet you the coach of the Jaguars, maybe in some very colorful language, had some variants of get your head in the game. Kind of like Vince Lombardi's old thing at the halftime. This is a football? And so the mindset, again, you need to understand that this football is supposed to go places. In very specific places, in very specific ways. And if you're not in it with your head, there's no way your heart can be in it. Your heart can be in it, but if your head's not in it, it's useless. And I just see that as an illustration of this, it's not a game of life, but the call of God on our lives to be not of this world. Listen, you're a professional football player. You should think different and act different than some little kid who's playing soccer in some field somewhere. You're different. Your life should be distinct. And it was, if you haven't seen it, go back and watch the highlights if you can find it. It was fascinating to see the Jaguars come back. Because suddenly now, somehow or another, it also became clear that in the second half, the Chargers went from planning to win to trying not to lose. And that's a mindset. It really is. It's so important that we understand this. Who am I? Why am I here? What should I do? Who am I? Why am I here? What should I do? And somewhere above that, and in the middle of that, and beneath that, and all around that is God. Only way to figure that out. Who you are, why you are. Now, what do you do? And certainly Daniel and his buddies, they nailed this. Absolutely. Well, here's the making it real questions. The first one connected to that first point. Do you see the correlation between distinction and convictions and discipline? That a life of distinction flows from a life being lived with convictions and discipline. Paul somewhere said, I buffet my body. And our body is often a battleground in this fallen world. I buffet my body lest I be disqualified. It doesn't say I buffet my body, right? I buffet my body. And the second question is, are you cultivating your not of this world mindset? And I just love this phrase, heart song. Make it a heart song too. Write a little song. Kind of like, Buddy the Elf when he was singing in that movie, I'm not of this world. However you can put the song together, but sincerely from your heart. Just sing the song, I'm not of this world. In your mind, remind yourself, I'm not of this world, I'm not of this world. Because until we really get the fact that we're not of this world, we cannot possibly influence and impact it the way God would have us to as we live a life of distinction, which is what this whole message is about. Living a life of distinction. I'm not of this world. Sometimes it tries to sing to me and tries to get me to dance. I'm just not of this world. It's not who I am. It's where I am, but it's not who I am. Here's the action step. Write down, this became clear to me in a fresh way this week. Just small things. Big changes happen by a bunch of small decisions all clumped together. You can't do anything, magnificent instantly. It's just a series of little choices and different choices. We always do what we've always done. We'll always be where we've always been. So we have to change what we do. And here, write down 3 small but specific and significant changes you can make today that will help your life be more distinctive in the days ahead. So this is all about as it pertains to your relationship with God and your influence in the world. Small things. And they may seem small, but some of them are bigger than others. If you don't have a regular time of the day and a regular place you go to be alone with God, that's something you could do starting today. You know, we sing the hymn, He walks with me, talks with me, I go to the garden alone. It doesn't say we go to the garden together. It says I go to the garden alone. Where's your garden? And when do you get together with God? Every day. Every day. That's a simple but significant thing you can do. Not so small, is it? One of the things I need to get back to, and especially as I stand in here flipping through Bible, is I need to remember the order of the books. I got them down pat in the New Testament. I got to go back to the Old Testament. So I'm not fishing for them. That's a simple thing I can do. It'll give me a better relationship with God's Word. The problem is I scroll on my phone now and I can just touch them. I don't need to remember what order they're in. It's like you don't need to remember anybody's phone number anymore. But it's good to know where they're at. And I don't know what 3 specific things you can do to help make your life more distinctive for the sake of God, but do that. Boy, you've been patient. This went longer than I thought it would. It always does. And we're going to pray before we go. Would you do that? God Almighty, we bow our heads and our hearts to you. We lay our lives before you. You're the maker of heaven and earth and everyone and everything. And we do look to you with grateful hearts. We know that you made us, and we know that you know us, and we know that you love us. And we thank you for your grace. We do pray today with an acute awareness of how much we need you to have your way if we're going to be who you've made us to be so we can do what you call us to do. Help us strengthen our not of this world mindset and heart song. Deliver us from being too much at home here when we're not yet really and finally and fully home with you at all. Not the way it's going to be. Deliver us from getting too comfortable and feeling too familiar in this life and in this world. And please hold and comfort us in a way we know as you do that. Help us enjoy being here, but let us not live for here. And we pray for those among us, because there are some among us, no doubt, who are